Marcus Kane lived a quiet life, or at least he tried to. To the people of Richmond, Virginia, he was just another man who kept to himself. He worked odd jobs, paid his bills on time, and spent most weekends reading books or taking long walks through the park. But beneath this calm exterior lay a secret so extraordinary that it could change lives, or end them. Marcus was not an ordinary man. For over 10 years, he had been a CIA agent, working undercover to stop criminals and protect innocent people. His missions took him all over the world, from the crowded streets of Bangkok to the icy mountains of Siberia. He was known within the agency as the Ghost because of his ability to blend into any environment without leaving a trace. But after years of dangerous work, Marcus wanted something different. He wanted peace. So he moved back to his hometown of Richmond, hoping to live a normal life while still serving the CIA when needed. Every day, Marcus followed the same routine. He woke up early, went for a jog around the neighborhood, grabbed coffee from the local cafe, and then headed to his small apartment to check emails. On weekends, he visited his mother, who always reminded him to eat better and find a nice girl to settle down with. To everyone around him, Marcus seemed like a regular guy trying to make ends meet. No one suspected that he carried secrets powerful enough to bring down entire governments. But even in Richmond, where life moved slower than in big cities, trouble had a way of finding Marcus. It started on a chilly Tuesday evening, just as the sun was setting behind the rows of brick houses. Marcus had spent the afternoon running errands, buying groceries, picking up dry cleaning, and stopping by the hardware store to fix a leaky faucet. As he drove home, humming along to an old jazz tune on the radio, he noticed flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. At first, Marcus didn't think much of it. Maybe he'd accidentally gone over the speed limit or forgotten to signal a turn. But as the police car pulled closer, his instincts kicked in. Something felt off. The officer who stepped out of the car looked young, barely out of his 20s, but there was a hardness in his eyes that made Marcus uneasy. Another officer joined him, a taller man with a scowl etched onto his face. Both wore badges, but their body language screamed arrogance. "License and registration," the younger officer barked, tapping on Marcus's window. Marcus rolled down the glass slowly, keeping his hands visible. "Evening, officers," he said politely. "Is everything okay?" The taller cop leaned forward, squinting at Marcus. "You were speeding back there. Didn't you see the sign?" Marcus frowned. He hadn't been speeding. He knew the roads well and always drove carefully. But arguing wouldn't help. Instead, he handed over his license and registration, watching as the officers examined them closely. "This your car?" the younger cop asked, his tone sharp. "Yes, sir," Marcus replied calmly. The two officers exchanged a glance before the taller one spoke again. "Mind if we take a look inside?" Marcus hesitated. He knew his rights. They couldn't search his car without probable cause or his permission. But refusing would only make things worse. "Go ahead," he said finally, leaning back in his seat. For the next 10 minutes, the officers rummaged through Marcus's belongings. They opened the trunk, flipped through his grocery bags, and even checked under the seats. Marcus sat silently, his jaw tight, as anger simmered beneath the surface. He wasn't surprised by their behavior. It wasn't the first time he'd been treated unfairly because of the color of his skin, but it still stung. When they found nothing incriminating, the taller cop smirked. "Looks clean, for now." Then, almost casually, he slipped a small bag of white powder under the passenger seat. Marcus's heart sank. He saw what they were doing. These men weren't interested in justice. They were looking for an excuse to ruin his life. Still, he said nothing. If he revealed his true identity, it would blow his cover. Not just here in Richmond, but everywhere. The CIA depended on secrecy, and Marcus couldn't risk exposing himself. "You're under arrest," the younger officer announced, pulling out handcuffs. "Possession with intent to distribute narcotics." Marcus let them cuff him, his mind racing. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but proving it wouldn't be easy. Not against cops who thought they were above the law. As they led him to the patrol car, Marcus glanced at his own vehicle, sitting abandoned on the side of the road. His phone, wallet, and keys were still inside. In that moment, he realized how quickly his quiet life had turned upside down. The ride to the station was silent except for the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the police radio. Marcus stared out the window, replaying the events in his head. He wondered if anyone would believe him when he told the truth. Would his neighbors stand up for him? What about the people at the cafe where he bought coffee every morning? Or would they assume the worst, just like the officers had? At the station, Marcus was booked and thrown into a holding cell. The space smelled of sweat and despair, and the cold metal bars pressed uncomfortably against his skin. Around him, other inmates muttered curses or stared blankly at the walls. Some looked guilty of their crimes, others seemed lost, like they didn't belong there. Marcus wondered which category he fell into. Despite the chaos around him, Marcus stayed focused. He knew panic wouldn't solve anything. Instead, he began observing his surroundings, the layout of the station, the routines of the guards, the faces of the other prisoners. Years of training had taught him to stay alert, even in the worst situations. He also thought about his options. Could he contact the CIA? Would they intervene, or would they leave him to fend for himself? As the hours dragged on, Marcus's thoughts drifted to his mother. She had raised him alone after his father died, working 2 jobs to put food on the table. She had taught him to be strong, to stand up for what was right, no matter how hard it got. Now, more than ever, he wished he could hear her voice. She would tell him to keep fighting, to never give up. By the time dawn broke, Marcus had made up his mind. He wouldn't let these corrupt cops win. He would fight back, not just for himself, but for everyone else who had been treated unfairly. He didn't know how yet, but he was determined to clear his name and expose the truth. Little did Marcus know this was just the beginning of a much bigger battle, one that would test his courage, challenge his beliefs, and force him to confront the darkest corners of humanity. But Marcus Kane wasn't afraid. He had faced danger before, and he would do it again. Because deep down, he knew one thing for certain: the truth always finds a way to come out. The sound of heavy metal doors slamming shut echoed through the cold, dimly lit hallway. Marcus Kane sat on a hard wooden bench in his cell, staring at the cracked concrete floor. The air smelled of sweat, rust, and despair. For most people, being locked up in jail would feel like the end of the world. But Marcus wasn't like most people. He had faced worse situations before, situations that would make ordinary men break. And yet this felt different. This time, he was trapped not by enemies abroad, but by his own country's failures. As the hours passed, Marcus began to observe the rhythms of the jail. Guards walked past his cell every few minutes, their boots clinking against the tiled floor. Inmates shouted curses or banged on the bars, demanding attention. Some were angry. Others seemed lost, as if they didn't understand how they ended up there. Marcus kept quiet, watching everything carefully. He knew survival depended on staying calm and gathering information. One of the first things Marcus noticed was the power dynamic inside the jail. A few inmates acted like kings, ordering others around and getting special treatment from the guards. These men weren't just criminals. They were pawns in a larger game. Marcus could tell by the way the guards ignored their bad behavior and even handed them extra food or cigarettes. It reminded him of the corrupt networks he dismantled overseas. Only this time, it was happening right here in Richmond. By the second day, Marcus had identified one inmate who stood out from the rest. His name was Derek, a tall, wiry man with sharp eyes and a scar running down his left cheek. Unlike the others, Derek didn't shout or beg for favors. Instead, he sat quietly in the corner of the common area, reading a worn-out book when allowed. Something about him intrigued Marcus. There was intelligence behind those eyes, a hint of someone who had once lived a very different life. During mealtime, Marcus decided to approach him. "Mind if I sit here?" Marcus asked, holding a tray of lukewarm soup and stale bread. Derek glanced up, studying Marcus for a moment before nodding. "Be my guest." They ate in silence for a while, listening to the chaos around them. Finally, Marcus spoke again. "You don't seem like the type who belongs here." Derek chuckled dryly. "Neither do you, brother." "So why are you?" Marcus hesitated. He couldn't reveal too much, not yet, but he needed someone to talk to. "Let's just say I got caught in the wrong place at the wrong time." "Same here," Derek said, leaning back against the wall. "Except I wasn't in the wrong place. I was doing my job, exposing corruption in the city government. Turns out, some people don't like the truth." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Corruption?" Derek nodded. "Yeah, found evidence linking cops to drug trafficking and illegal deals. Thought I could take them down. Instead, they framed me for murder." He sighed, shaking his head. "Guess I underestimated how far they'd go to protect themselves." Marcus listened intently, his mind racing. Could these dirty cops be connected to the ones who arrested him? It made sense. The planted drugs, the harassment, the arrogance. If Derek was telling the truth, then Marcus wasn't dealing with isolated incidents of racism. He was facing a web of corruption that stretched higher than he imagined. Over the next few days, Marcus and Derek continued talking. They shared stories, piecing together clues about the system that had swallowed them both. Derek explained how certain inmates were used as informants, pressured into keeping quiet or ratting out others. Guards turned a blind eye to violence and threats, ensuring loyalty from those they controlled. It was a twisted game of power, and everyone inside was a pawn. Meanwhile, Marcus began using his skills to gain respect among the other inmates. When a fight broke out in the common area, he stepped in to stop it, showing strength without aggression. When someone needed advice or help, he offered it without expecting anything in return. Slowly, word spread that Marcus wasn't someone to mess with, but also that he wasn't cruel like the guards or the powerful inmates. As trust grew, Derek confided more in Marcus. "I've been trying to gather proof," he admitted one evening. "There's a guy on the outside who can get messages to reporters. If we can find solid evidence, maybe we can blow this whole thing open." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "We'll need more than rumors. We need names, dates, transactions, something undeniable." "That's where you come in," Derek said with a grin. "You've got that look about you, like you've seen things most of us can't imagine. Whatever you did before ending up here, I think it might help." Marcus smiled fainter. Marcus Kane knew that surviving in jail wasn't just about staying out of trouble. It was about building connections. He had spent years undercover in dangerous places, learning how to read people and earn their trust. Now, locked behind bars, those skills would prove invaluable. With Derek by his side, Marcus started laying the groundwork for a plan to expose the truth. Not just about his own case, but about the corruption that had destroyed countless lives. Every morning, as sunlight filtered weakly through the barred windows, Marcus used the time to observe. He noticed which inmates were loyal to the guards and which ones hated them. He watched how the guards treated certain prisoners with favoritism, slipping them contraband or turning a blind eye to their misdeeds. It was clear that this wasn't just a jail. It was a hub of organized crime, run by dirty cops and greedy inmates. One day during recreation hour, Marcus approached an older man named Jamal, who sat alone near the basketball court. Jamal was quiet, rarely speaking to anyone, but Marcus had seen him intervene when younger inmates picked fights. There was wisdom in his eyes, and Marcus sensed he might be someone worth talking to. "Mind if I join you?" Marcus asked, sitting down beside him. Jamal glanced at him briefly before returning his gaze to the cracked pavement. "Go ahead. I've been watching," Marcus said after a moment. "You don't seem like the type to cause problems." Jamal shrugged. "I've been here long enough to know better than to make waves, but that doesn't mean I'm okay with what goes on here." "What do you mean?" Jamal leaned closer, lowering his voice. "These guards, they're not just locking us up. They're running drugs, money, even weapons. Some of these guys," he nodded toward a group of rowdy inmates, "are working for them. If you step out of line, they'll make sure you regret it." Marcus nodded slowly. "Sounds like you've seen a lot." "More than I care to remember," Jamal replied bitterly. "But no one listens to old men like me. Most folks here are too scared, or too selfish, to do anything about it." "Well," Marcus said with a faint smile, "maybe it's time someone did something." Jamal raised an eyebrow. "And who's going to do that?" "You." "Maybe," Marcus said simply, "but I can't do it alone." Jamal studied him for a moment, then chuckled softly. "You got guts, kid. That much I'll give you." With Jamal now part of their circle, Marcus, Derek, and a few other trusted inmates began meeting secretly whenever they could. Using coded language and hidden signals, they pieced together information about the corrupt network operating inside the jail. Derek shared details about the officers he'd exposed before his arrest, names, photos, and financial records. Jamal added insights about the inmates acting as informants for the guards. Together, they created a rough map of the operation. But gathering evidence wasn't enough. They needed a way to get it out of the jail without alerting the guards. That's where another inmate, a tech-savvy teenager named Calvin, came in. Calvin had been arrested for hacking into bank accounts, and though he was young, he had a knack for finding solutions to impossible problems. Had taken the first step toward freedom, and he was ready to take the next. "Here's the deal," Marcus explained to Calvin during one of their whispered conversations. "We need to send messages to someone on the outside, a reporter or someone we can trust. Can you help us?" Calvin smirked. "Depends. What kind of gear are we working with?" Marcus pulled out a small phone he'd managed to smuggle into the jail, a basic flip phone disguised as a deck of cards. "This is all we've got." Calvin examined it skeptically. "Not much, but it'll work. Give me a few days." True to his word, Calvin rigged the phone to connect to a nearby Wi-Fi signal that leaked into the jail from a nearby cafe. From there, they could send encrypted messages to Derek's contact on the outside, a journalist named Lisa Monroe. Lisa had worked with Derek before his arrest and was eager to help bring the corrupt officers to justice. As the weeks passed, Marcus and his allies gathered more evidence. They documented instances of abuse, bribes, and illegal activities, carefully recording everything in code to avoid detection. At night, when the guards were distracted, they slipped notes under mattresses or hid them in cracks in the walls. Every piece of information brought them closer to exposing the truth, but also put them in greater danger. The tension reached a boiling point one evening when Marcus overheard two guards talking outside his cell. Their voices were low, but Marcus caught enough to understand what they were saying. "He's getting too comfortable," one guard muttered. "Word is he's been asking questions." "Yeah, well, questions lead to answers," the other replied coldly. "And answers lead to trouble. We can't let that happen." Marcus's heart raced. He knew exactly who they were talking about. The guards weren't just suspicious. They were planning to silence him permanently. That night, Marcus called an emergency meeting with Derek, Jamal, and Calvin. "They're onto us," he said bluntly. "If we don't act fast, they'll move against us." "What do you suggest?" Derek asked, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "We hit them where it hurts, their pride," Marcus said. "We leak the evidence we've gathered so far. Even if it's incomplete, it'll create chaos. People will start asking questions, and the guards won't have time to cover their tracks." "And what about us?" Jamal asked, his tone cautious. "Once this gets out, they'll come after everyone involved." "We'll protect each other," Marcus promised. "But staying quiet isn't an option anymore. If we don't fight back, they'll keep hurting innocent people, and we'll lose our chance to clear our names." After a brief pause, Derek nodded. "Let's do it." With renewed determination, the group finalized their plan. Calvin sent the first batch of evidence to Lisa Monroe, along with a warning: publish it immediately. Meanwhile, Marcus instructed the others to spread rumors among the inmates about the corruption. The goal was to create panic and distrust, forcing the guards to scramble to maintain control. Within days, the effects of their actions became clear. Inmates began refusing orders, demanding explanations for unfair treatment. Guards retaliated with violence, but the unrest only grew louder. Outside the jail, Lisa published her article, sparking outrage across the city. Protesters gathered outside the station, holding signs that read "Justice for the Framed" and "Expose the Truth." Inside the jail, Marcus felt a flicker of hope. For the first time since his arrest, he believed they might actually win. But he knew the fight was far from over. The corrupt officers wouldn't go down without a fight, and neither would Marcus. As he stood in the crowded common area surrounded by cheering inmates, Marcus allowed himself a small smile. The courtroom buzzed with energy as people packed the benches, eager to witness what promised to be one of Richmond's most talked about trials. Reporters scribbled notes, cameras flashed, and whispers filled the air. At the center of it all sat Marcus Kane, calm and composed, dressed in a neatly pressed suit. To anyone watching, he looked like just another defendant fighting for his freedom. But those who knew him understood that this was no ordinary case. Marcus had chosen to represent himself, despite offers from public defenders. He didn't trust anyone else to tell his story the way he wanted it told. Sitting at the defense table, he flipped through documents, organizing his thoughts. Beside him sat Derek, now released on bail, acting as his unofficial advisor. Though Derek couldn't officially participate in the trial, his insights were invaluable. On the other side of the room, the prosecution team stood confidently, flanked by the two officers who had arrested Marcus months earlier. Officer Harris, the taller of the two, smirked smugly, while Officer Grayson fidgeted nervously. They believed their lies would hold up under scrutiny, but Marcus had other plans. As the judge entered and called the court to order, Marcus took a deep breath. This was his moment to fight back, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been wronged by the corrupt system. Opening statements. The prosecutor began his opening statement, painting Marcus as a dangerous criminal. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, pacing dramatically, "the evidence against the defendant is overwhelming. On the night of his arrest, officers found illegal drugs in his vehicle. These substances are linked to organized crime syndicates. We believe Mr. Kane was involved in distributing narcotics throughout our community." Marcus listened carefully, noting the prosecutor's tone and body language. When it was his turn to speak, he rose slowly, looking directly at the jury. "Thank you, Your Honor," Marcus began, his voice steady and clear. What you've heard so far is not the truth. I am not a drug dealer. In fact, I'm not even who they say I am. My name is Marcus Kane, and I am an innocent man framed by officers who abuse their power. Today, I will prove that. The courtroom fell silent. Even the reporters stopped typing, stunned by Marcus's bold claim. He continued, outlining his plan to expose the corruption behind his arrest. By the time he sat down, the jury was intrigued and skeptical. It was up to Marcus to convince them. Fair enough. The courtroom erupted into chaos as Marcus revealed his true identity. Gasps echoed through the room, and reporters scrambled to capture every word. The judge banged her gavel repeatedly, demanding order, but it was clear that nothing could calm the storm Marcus had unleashed. I am not just Marcus Kane, he said firmly, his voice cutting through the noise. I am a CIA agent. These officers framed me because they feared I would expose their crimes. Here is proof of my credentials. He handed over sealed documents provided by the CIA, which confirmed his status as an operative. The prosecutor's face turned pale, and the two officers exchanged panicked glances. The judge examined the documents carefully before addressing the court. This changes everything, she declared. Officers Harris and Grayson, you are under arrest for obstruction of justice, planting evidence, and conspiracy. Bailiffs, take them into custody. As the officers were led away in handcuffs, Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him. The truth had finally come out, and justice, though delayed, had been served. The jury didn't even need to deliberate. The judge dismissed all charges against Marcus, declaring him innocent. Cheers broke out among the spectators, many of whom had followed the case closely and believed in Marcus's innocence from the start. But for Marcus, this victory was bittersweet. The trial had exposed the deep corruption within the police force, but it had also revealed how fragile trust in institutions could be. He knew the fight wasn't over, not for him, and certainly not for others still trapped in similar situations. A city demands change. Outside the courthouse, a crowd of supporters gathered, holding signs that read "Justice prevails" and "No more corruption." News of Marcus's exoneration spread quickly, sparking outrage across Richmond. Protesters marched through the streets, demanding accountability from law enforcement. Community leaders called for reforms, including independent oversight boards and stricter penalties for misconduct. Marcus stood at the top of the courthouse steps, surrounded by friends, allies, and strangers who had rallied behind him. Derek was there too, clapping him on the back. "You did it, man," Derek said with a grin. "You took down the monsters." Marcus nodded, though his expression remained thoughtful. "It's not just about me," he replied. "This is bigger than one case. We have to keep pushing for change, or nothing will ever improve." His words resonated with the crowd. People began chanting his name, hailing him as a hero. But Marcus didn't feel like a hero. He felt like someone who had survived a battle, one that had cost him dearly. His quiet life was gone, replaced by a spotlight he hadn't asked for. And while he was grateful for the support, he couldn't help but wonder what came next. Leaving the CIA. Later that evening, Marcus sat alone in his apartment, staring at the stack of papers on his kitchen table. Among them were official letters from the CIA thanking him for his service and offering him a promotion. They admired his work during the trial and wanted him to return to active duty. But Marcus hesitated. For years, he had dedicated his life to serving his country, often at great personal cost. Now he wondered if it was time to walk away. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. On the other end, his handler answered immediately. "Marcus," the voice said warmly. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine," Marcus replied. "But I've been thinking. I don't think I can go back to the agency." There was a pause on the other end. "Are you sure? You're one of our best operatives. We need people like you." "I know," Marcus said softly, "and I appreciate everything the agency has done for me. But I've seen too much, from both sides. The system is broken, and I want to fix it. Maybe not as a spy, but as someone who fights for real change." His handler sighed. "I understand. If this is what you truly want, we'll support you. Just remember, you'll always have a place here if you change your mind." "Thank you," Marcus said. "That means a lot." After hanging up, Marcus leaned back in his chair, feeling a mix of sadness and determination. Leaving the CIA wasn't easy. It was the only career he'd ever known. But he realized that sometimes moving forward meant stepping away from what was familiar. And for Marcus, the path ahead was clear. A new mission. Over the following weeks, Marcus threw himself into advocacy work. He partnered with organizations fighting racial injustice and wrongful imprisonment. using his story to raise awareness. He gave speeches at schools, churches, and community centers, urging people to speak out against corruption and demand better from their leaders. His message was simple: if we stand together, we can make a difference. Derek joined him in this mission, helping to organize protests and campaigns. Together, they formed a nonprofit called Truth Unbound, dedicated to supporting victims of police misconduct and pushing for systemic reform. With Lisa Monroe's help, they published investigative reports exposing corruption in other cities, inspiring activists nationwide. One day, as Marcus walked through the park where he used to jog, he noticed something different. Families played together, laughter filled the air, and posters promoting unity lined the paths. It was a small reminder that progress, no matter how slow, was possible. He stopped by a bench and sat down, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. For the first time in months, he felt at peace. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready. Justice might not win every battle, but Marcus knew that as long as people kept fighting, hope would prevail. Looking ahead, as Marcus left the park, he glanced at a flyer taped to a lamppost. It advertised an upcoming rally organized by Truth Unbound. At the bottom, in bold letters, were the words, "Join us. Be the change." Marcus smiled. He had already decided to attend and to continue speaking out. Because for him, this wasn't the end of a journey. It was the beginning of a new one. A journey toward fairness, equality, and a future where no one else would have to endure what he had. The fight wasn't over, but Marcus Kane was more determined than ever. He had faced darkness and emerged stronger. And now he was ready to light the way for others.